October 16th, 1850. Dear Bones, I have a tale to tell you which seems a little strange and even disquieting to both Cal and me. See what you think. If nothing else, it may serve to amuse you while you battle the mosquitoes. 2 days after I mailed my last to you, a group of 4 young ladies arrived from the Corners under the supervision of an elderly lady of intimidatingly competent visage named Mrs. Cloris, to set the place in order and to remove some of the dust that had been causing me to sneeze seemingly at every other step. They all seemed a little nervous as they went about their chores. Indeed, one flighty miss uttered a small screech when I entered the upstairs parlour as she dusted. I asked Mrs. Cloris about this. She was dusting the downstairs hall with grim determination that would have quite amazed you, her hair done up in an old faded bandana. And she turned to me and said with an air of determination, "They don't like the house, and I don't like the house, sir, because it has always been a bad house." My jaw dropped at this unexpected bit, and she went on in a kindlier tone. "I do not mean to say that Stephen Boone was not a fine man, for he was. I cleaned for him every second Thursday all the time he was here, as I cleaned for his father, Mr. Randolph Boone, until he and his wife disappeared in 1816. Mr. Stephen was a good and kindly man, and so you seem, sir, if you will pardon my bluntness, I know no other way to speak, but the house is bad, and it always has been, and no Boone has ever been happy here since your grandfather Robert and his brother Philip fell out over stolen," and here she paused almost guiltily, "items in 1789. "Such memories these folks have, Bones," Mrs. Cloris continued. "The house was built in unhappiness, has been lived in with unhappiness. There has been blood spilt on its floors. As you may or may not know, Bones, my Uncle Randolph was involved in an accident on the cellar stairs which took the life of his daughter Marcella. He then took his own life in a fit of remorse. The incident is related in one of Stephen's letters to me on the sad occasion of his dead sister's birthday. There has been disappearance and accident. I have worked here, Mr. Boone, and I am neither blind nor deaf. I've heard awful sounds in the walls, sir, awful sounds, thumpings and crashings, and once a strange wailing that was half laughter. It fair made my blood curdle. It's a dark place, sir." And there she halted, perhaps afraid she had spoken too much. As for myself, I hardly knew whether to be offended or amused, curious or merely matter of fact. I'm afraid that amusement won the day. "And what do you suspect, Mrs. Cloris? Ghosts rattling chains?" But she only looked at me oddly. "Ghosts there may be, but it's not ghosts in the walls. It's not ghosts that wail and blubber like the damned and crash and blunder away in the darkness. It's—" "Come, Mrs. Cloris," I prompted her. "You've come this far. Now can you finish what you've begun?" The strangest expression of terror, pique, and, I would swear to it, religious awe passed over her face. "Some die not," she whispered. "Some live in the twilight shadows between to serve him." And that was the end. For some minutes I continued to tax her, but she grew only more obstinate and would say no more. At last I desisted, fearing she might gather herself up and quit the premises. This is the end of one episode, but a second occurred the following evening. Calvin had laid a fire downstairs, and I was sitting in the living room, drowsing over a copy of the Intelligencer and listening to the sound of wind-driven rain on the large bay window. I felt comfortable as only one can on such a night, when all is miserable outside and all is warmth and comfort inside. But a moment later, Cal appeared at the door, looking excited and a bit nervous. "Are you awake, sir?" he asked. "Barely," I said. "What is it?" "I found something upstairs I think you should see," he responded, with the same air of suppressed excitement. I got up and followed him. As we climbed the wide stairs, Calvin said, "I was reading a book in the upstairs study, a rather strange one, when I heard a noise in the wall." "Rats," I said. "Is that all?" He paused on the landing, looking at me solemnly. The lamp he held cast weird lurking shadows on the dark draperies and on the half-seen portraits that seemed now to leer rather than smile. Outside, The wind rose to a brief scream and then subsided grudgingly. "Not rats," Cal said. There was a kind of blundering, thudding sound from behind the bookcases, and then a horrible gurgling, horrible, sir, and scratching, as if something were struggling to get out, to get at me. You can imagine my amazement, Bones. Calvin is not the type to give way to hysterical flights of imagination. It began to seem that there was a mystery here after all, and perhaps an ugly one indeed. "What then?" I asked him. We had resumed down the hall, and I could see the light from the study spilling forth onto the floor of the gallery. I viewed it with some trepidation. The night seemed no longer comfortable. The scratching noise stopped. After a moment, the thudding, shuffling sounds began again, this time moving away from me. It paused once, and I swear I heard a strange, almost inaudible laugh. I went to the bookcase and began to push and pull, thinking there might be a partition or a secret door. "You found one?" Cal paused at the door to the study. "No, but I found this." We stepped in, and I saw a square black hole in the left case. The books at that point were nothing but dummies, and what Cal had found was a small hiding place. I flashed my lamp within it and saw nothing but a thick fall of dust which must have been decades old. "There was only this," Cal said quietly, and handed me a yellowed foolscap. The thing was a map, drawn in spider-thin strokes of black ink, the map of a town or village. There were perhaps 7 buildings, and one, clearly marked with a steeple, bore this legend beneath it, "The worm that doth corrupt." In the upper left corner, to what would have been the northwest of this little village, an arrow pointed. Inscribed beneath it, "Chapelwaite." Calvin said, "In town, sir, someone rather superstitiously mentioned a deserted village called Jerusalem's Lot. It's a place they steer clear of." "But this?" I asked, fingering the odd legend below the steeple. "I don't know." A memory of Mrs. Cloris, adamant yet fearful, passed through my mind. "The worm," I muttered. "Do you know something, Mr. Boone?" "Perhaps. It might be amusing to have a look for this town tomorrow, do you think, Cal?" He nodded, eyes lighting. We spent almost an hour after this looking for some breach in the wall behind the cubbyhole Cal had found, but with no success. Nor was there a recurrence of the noises Cal had described. We retired with no further adventure that night. On the following morning, Calvin and I set out on our ramble through the woods. The rain of the night before had ceased, but the sky was somber and lowering. I could see Cal looking at me with some doubtfulness, and I hastened to reassure him that should I tire, or the journey prove too far, I would not hesitate to call a halt to the affair. We had equipped ourselves with a picnic lunch, a fine buck-white compass, and of course the odd and ancient map of Jerusalem's Lot. It was a strange and brooding day. Not a bird seemed to sing, nor an animal to move, as we made our way through the great and gloomy stands of pine to the south and east. The only sounds were those of our own feet, and the steady pound of the Atlantic against the headlands. The smell of the sea, almost preternaturally heavy, was our constant companion. We had gone no more than 2 miles, when we struck an overgrown road of what I believe were once called the corduroy variety. This tended in our general direction, and we struck off along it, making brisk time. We spoke little. The day, with its still and ominous quality, weighed heavily on our spirits. At about 11 o'clock, we heard the sound of rushing water. The remnant of road took a hard turn to the left, and on the other side of a boiling, slaty little stream, like an apparition, was Jerusalem's Lot. The stream was perhaps 8 feet across, spanned by a moss-grown footbridge. On the far side, Bones, stood the most perfect little village you might imagine, understandably weathered, but amazingly preserved. Several houses, done in that austere yet commanding form for which the Puritans were justly famous, stood clustered near the steeply sheared bank. Further beyond, along a weed-grown thoroughfare, stood 3 or 4 of what might have been primitive business establishments, and beyond that, the spire of the church marked on the map, rising up to the grey sky and looking grim beyond description with its peeled paint and tarnished leaning cross. "The town is well named," Cal said softly beside me. We crossed to the town and began to poke through it. And this is where my story grows slightly amazing, Bones, so prepare yourself. The air seemed leaden as we walked among the buildings, weighted, if you will. The edifices were in a state of decay, shutters torn off, roofs crumbled under the weight of heavy snows gone by, windows dusty and leering. Shadows from odd corners and warped angles seemed to sit in sinister pools.